There's no favouritism here, and even if you're a big name and a big star, I'm not scared to get you shipped out if you're not going to do what I want.
Yeah, I think from speaking to people sort of after that point, that were then aware of how he'd handled his circumstances at Sporting when he went in, I think they felt that something like that was probably inevitable. And that's not
Right.
to say that, yeah, he came in with that agenda at all, but I think he came in with a mandate to, in his mind, raise standards.
Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and this is Inside United with Laurie Whitwell, and that means, of course, Laurie Whitwell from The Athletic is here. How are you doing, Laurie?
Hi Joe, I'm very good, thank you, mate. Been a little bit of time. Sorry that I'm not with you in person. Just quite a busy schedule for me at the moment, but I had to make time to chat to you to discover, get into all things United.
There's loads to talk about, and obviously no problem that you aren't in the studio. It's great to chat in a sort of face-to-face over the airwaves manner anyway. There is loads to talk about. Man United looking pretty good at the moment, obviously room for improvement. It's a couple of draws, a few wins as well. You wrote a big article about the sort of the first season, or the first year, should I say, because it's not the first season, of Ruben Amorim. There's loads of stuff in there. His style, his management, the tactics, the way the club perceive him and his tactics, the way the players perceive him. There's loads to get into. I also want to talk a little bit about transfers as well, because yes, it's 6 weeks till the window opens, but we've seen the likes of Jason Wilcox talking about how we need to buy the best players and continue to bring in world-class and top-class talent. There's loads to get into on that front as well. But let's start with this 1 year of Ruben Amorim. My first question is, this sort of article, how does it go about getting written? Because, obviously there are things in this article that pertain to 6, 8, 12 months ago in terms of when they happened. But a lot of this, or most of this, I would say, is sort of either new information entirely or new details on sort of ideas we had at the time. Do you go back and ask someone what was going on 12 months ago? Can I get a quote from that time? Or are these little bits, little scraps of cloth that you sort of stitch together to make this wonderful tapestry 12 months later?
To wrap around yourself when it's getting lower temperatures and winter time. Yeah, the winter wardrobe is coming out with this piece. To be honest, it's just continuous conversation with people throughout, really. And then some of these little details, some of these little stories, I always think that they are, when you get specific information, just helps paint the picture much better than kind of general expressions of people's interpretations of how Amorim's doing, because you can kind of have a conversation with somebody and they say, yeah, it's fine, he's good, it's not ideal sometimes, there's a bit of to and fro, but yeah, it's good. And then when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of it and you're able to kind of tell the story better with these kind of specific examples, I just think that helps, the readers, fans get a better interpretation of what's been going on. And so, yeah, it's just from conversation with contacts throughout the year, really, as you do, and then perhaps the way that we have it at The Athletic, it's not necessarily that's going to be a news story. So obviously I think the first bit of information that I share in terms of the end of Eric Ten Hag's reign is the sort of dressing room after the Porto game where it was 3-3 and he had a very strong sort of interrogation inquest from Eric Ten Hag after the game because he was disappointed and upset with his players' defensive discipline in that game when they were 2-0 up and then let the lead slip to a 3-2. It looked like it was going to be a defeat, 10 men, and then Harry Maguire pops up at the end. But he still went into them in quite a long inquest. And then, he was asked to leave the room by Bruno Fernandes and other sort of senior players, which wasn't in itself that unusual. I think they've had that before, certainly after the Newcastle game in Ten Hag's first season, actually, when they'd won the Carabao Cup, but they'd had a bit of a dip. They'd lost 7-0 to Anfield, sorry. Yeah, they had a meeting after that game at Newcastle where they'd lost, and I think Lisandro Martinez was quite vocal in that. And they I think that allows players perhaps to just be open about, their feelings and also with each other, be very strong, not necessarily, the manager has to go and therefore let's talk about the manager. It's actually more, I think the idea is to have a dressing room that governs itself, really. But yeah, similar thing. And then they won actually the next 3 matches after that sort of Newcastle inquest. So, but then the Porto match is a different context entirely. You could sense that Ten Hag's position was weaker, and Diogo Dalot was one of the players that stood up and very passionately, I'm told, was basically saying to the players, even if you don't agree with what Ten Hag is saying, and it felt like Dalot didn't, that we have to sort of perform for ourselves, and we kind of, but it felt like a potential sort of breaking moment, I would say. Now, I didn't know about this at the time, so back to your sort of original question. Okay. I think if I'd found that out at the time, you might do that as a news story straight away, because it kind of expresses the potential disconnect there, and the potential future for Erik ten Hag departing the club. It wasn't straight away that he did. It was the end of that month in October, but they had the Exco meeting at Ineos headquarters. A few days after that, there was the Aston Villa game in between where they drew 0-0. And then at that Exco meeting was when they started to look at potential successors to Ten Hag this time round, after obviously the FA Cup final as well. So that, I didn't know the story at the time. I might have done it at the time if I'd known it. It's something that I've then become aware of later. And then we're sort of always thinking of perhaps ways to tell people about what's going on at the club if we have enough information. And so, I think a year of Amorim being at the club felt like a good anniversary, shall we say, to kind of go, okay, let's take a moment here to pause. It's an international break as well, so you kind of got an opportunity there to kind of delve deeper into some of the subjects that you're not able to do when there's matches. I know it's not midweeks matches this season, so maybe you'd have space during the campaign, but it felt like a good opportunity to kind of delve into it. And I just felt that particular episode was perhaps a good way of showing the kind of situation that Amorim inherited, in terms of having this friction, these kind of meetings that go on, strong personalities, a lot of passion, and then he came into it and he wanted to instill his own discipline as well. So I think the next story that I go into is the meeting that he had at the end of the season, after they'd lost the Europa League final, and he tells Garnacho that he needs to have a good agent this summer because he's staying, and he also had criticism for other players in that meeting, but pointedly Manuel Ugarte, who he'd worked with at Sporting, he felt like his work rate was slipping at United and he wanted more from him. And I think that showed to people that whatever previous relationship he might have with a player, whatever reputation the player might have, he's broadly fair in terms of wanting commitment and desire and professionalism from his players. So those two stories felt like they fitted quite nicely together for me to show this is what Amorim inherited, this is how he goes about it, and obviously we can debate and interrogate that, I suppose. But so long answer to your one very simple question, Joe, but it's something that comes together over sort of many weeks and months, and then we kind of try and find a place that it fits nicely to kind of tell people a little bit about the club.
Well, it makes sense. Like you said, some things people will be more free with certain information after the fact, I'm sure. Yep. Especially stuff that criticises or that is a kind of eye on the players and the manager having disagreements. That's the sort of thing that's particularly protected at the time, I would imagine, because you never want a current manager being criticised either publicly or in the press by a current player. Just on the Ten Hag stuff, obviously I don't want to go back too far, but I'm trying to sort of use this as maybe a sort of a barometer for how things could develop under Ruben Amorim. So this idea that, even if you don't like the style or, what Ten Hag's telling us to do, we've got to play for ourselves, which makes a lot of sense. You see loads of former players talk about that, and this sort of self-governing dressing room thing that, there's a classic sort of Gary Neville, Roy Keane type chat. You can almost imagine it taking place now, can't you? Those two saying how, even if Sir Alex wasn't there, we wouldn't have just, taken the piss and had a laugh. We wanted to do it because, we governed ourselves a little bit. And I mean, I don't mean this as any disrespect to Dalot, but he's someone that is not necessarily 100% certain of his place in the team. He'll often get sort of shifted around for other players. I mean, he often plays, so he's not someone that is, very much, I won't say he's a fringe player, but he's a player that has got a bit of an interesting dynamic with the fans and isn't necessarily the first name on the team sheet. Is that often the case where, obviously in a dream world, you've got Roy Keane, who is your captain, your most vocal player in the dressing room. He's the one setting the standards. That seems very sort of congruous and it makes sense. How does that dynamic work, do you think, when you've got someone maybe like Dalot, who isn't necessarily presumably thought of by his teammates as the best player in the dressing room, like Roy Keane was, and yet he's one of the sort of more vocal figures. Do you think that's a usual dynamic? Is there people in that dressing room where you think, actually, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be them, but they're one of the people that is there for their personality kind of off the pitch?
Yeah, well, I was actually... That was one of the points that really interested me, that it was Dallo that sort of said this. And so I think that shows perhaps a different side to his personality than we see necessarily. He's always very good with media. He always will speak up after games, in difficult moments, and he's very eloquent with his words and clearly committed to United. A very, super professional really in terms of what he does when he's trying to do recovery or whatever else at Carrington. I think he actually was Players Player of the Season, wasn't he, 23-24? So this would have been, this was October 24, so he was kind of had that, I suppose, prestige in terms of his ranking in the squad, at least, to come into and say something like this and take control of that situation in the way that he did. But I think I think all players, ideally you want several players, don't you, to be able to have these sort of strong characters. That's certainly what Amorim wants in his squad. That's what Erik ten Hag wanted as well. That they kind of do speak about quite similar things, really, accepting that they go about it in a different way, both from a personality point of view and a tactical point of view. But I think that, you look at Dallo now, and he's in the leadership group that Amorim has sort of constructed, really. I think it's felt like it was a bit of a player and coach-led selection. But I asked Amorim about it actually after the Spurs game, because Matthijs de Ligt isn't in the leadership group, for example, and he looks like someone that could actually be even a captain maybe of the club in future if if Amorim wants to keep him, and if the executives at the club want to do the same. So Dallo's in the leadership group alongside Lisandro Martinez, Mazraoui, an interesting name in there as well, Harry Maguire, Tom Heaton, Bruno Fernandes, of course. But that group is kind of, it's not necessarily one that, probably only Bruno Fernandes is guaranteed to start every week. So it's kind of interesting, the names that are in there. But I think Amorim's answer to me in terms of asking about de Ligt was that comes with a certain amount of responsibility at Carrington. So I'm sort of thinking like admin roles and stuff like that. The kind of, let's organise the social, or making sure that discipline is upheld, amongst your teammates. So, but I agree with you. I think it's interesting. I think certainly that it's a dressing room is full of different characters and personalities. I'm sure there would be people that would, have disagreements with each other. But as long as they kind of come together and ultimately they're all aiming for the same thing, which is to win football matches for Man United, then I don't mind a kind of robust dressing room inquest, to be honest.
He says in the article as well about how Amorim isn't typically one for kind of sit-down, face-to-face meetings with the whole squad. Now, I guess if you're playing and you're starting week in, week out, that isn't much of an issue, although maybe some players like to communicate face-to-face. But for someone, and I'm going to use the name Kobbie Mainoo just because I think he's the most usable example in this instance, and he's the one that people talk about the most. Is there any sense that that's frustrating for people? Because sometimes you might want to say, come on, let's talk this out. What is it that I'm lacking? What is it that you want from me? How can I do this? And, am I going to get chances to prove myself? Or is it literally just show, don't tell? Work harder in training and you'll play?
Yeah, I think Kobbie Mainoo is probably a good example, to be honest, because obviously he, wanted, I think, a meeting, whilst the transfer window was still open, a kind of more significant meeting where he could get feedback, and it was only after the window, and Amorim said afterwards that he wanted to wait until after the window had closed, so it didn't feel like he was just speaking to Kobbie on a one-on-one basis to kind of convince him to stay. He kind of wanted it to work itself out naturally, really. There's certainly, I would say, players that probably want more sort of tailored feedback, one-on-one, face-to-face. I think from Amorim's point of view, there's a couple of things probably going on. One being that, I think his management style would be like this anyway, but also he is 40 years old, so he's he's a young head coach, isn't he? But I think he feels like he has to have that sort of separation between himself and the players to a degree. Obviously you want to have a good relationship, but equally it needs to be a boss player relationship as much as anything. And so if you're having sort of regular one-on-ones, maybe that sort of changes the dynamic a little bit. That being said, also on the training pitches, he is pretty hands-on with players. He will do quite a lot of walkthroughs in shape in the system that he wants, and kind of making sure that players are even, on the right patch of grass to 1 or 2 yards. If a ball goes in a certain position and they're kind of walking it through and they're not quite in the right place, it'll go and put them in the right place. So there is that, at least, tactile one-on-one situation, so that he will probably feel, well, if you're not getting it from those kind of circumstances, then why do I need to sort of sit down with you and go through it again at a later stage? So I think he does want players to kind of figure it out themselves. But yeah, you can certainly debate that as a style, and I guess the proof will be in the pudding as to whether United are successful or not. But obviously they've had an uptick recently, and so yeah, if that continues, then you can kind of go, okay, you can see where he's coming from with it. But certainly it's one that's been debated. I think players have had conversations around the way that he is, but I think he would also say, well, I've got my coaches as well. So you've got a strong team that he brought with him from Sporting, that he's known for several years and entrusts with them and delegates to them. So he would probably say that, well, I've got coaches as well that you can have those kind of discussions with to try and win your place back. And yeah, you've got the training pitches and you've got matches occasionally, if you're getting chances there to prove it. So we don't necessarily need to kind of go through it in a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Because you hear stories down the years of like people asking for a meeting with Sir Alex Ferguson and stuff, and the Paul Scholes one about asking for more money, and I think Rooney's
good one,
talked about a couple. They sound very much by appointment only, don't they? It sounds like you can maybe go and ask for. I wonder if it's a similar thing with Amorim of, he's not going to turn away and pretend you're not there if you want to have a chat with him, but he's never going to be right, we're going to go through the sort of the rota of who comes and has a chat with Mr. Amorim today. It sounds like it's, like you said, it's sort of Bruno gets a bit of that because he's the captain, and then it can sort of feed back from there. Just, you mentioned Ugarte before. I think it's an interesting point about, calling out someone that you may be perceived to have a relationship with, or that you may have a favouritism towards. Obviously, Marcus Rashford is another one that, it's not easy to come in and kind of ostracise and, marginalise basically United's, with Bruno probably most famous and sort of the face of Manchester United at the time. Do you think, I'm not saying that was a purposeful thing, but we saw Ten Hag come in and do it with Ronaldo. We saw Amorim come in and do it with Rashford in particular. Do you think that's almost like I don't want to say he did it on purpose, because that's just, I don't want to put words in your mouth or make you answer that question, but do you think at times that can almost be beneficial? That the manager shows everyone that there's no favouritism here, and even if you're a big name and a big star, I'm not scared to get you shipped out if you're not going to do what I want.
Yeah, I think from speaking to people sort of after that point, that were then aware of how he'd handled his circumstances at Sporting when he went in, I think they felt that something like that was probably inevitable. And that's not to say that, he came in with that agenda at all, but I think he came in with a mandate to, in his mind, raise standards, right? Like, so I think that's something that it certainly could have been questioned previously. I mean, Ten Hag did the same. That's what he wanted to do, and that's why he obviously fell out with Ronaldo, because he felt that Ronaldo wasn't committed to the pressing strategy and training, and even Jadon Sancho, to another degree, that was an issue as well, in terms of his application. And so I think Amorim just felt that he came in with from a position of strength. So you are right. I mean, taking on Rashford is such a big call to make, and he ultimately felt that he needed to do it to get a better environment and better results on the pitch. And again, we will see in the fullness of time on that. But there was obviously specific reasons why he acted and did what he did. So I think it just shows that, for all the fact that he is very charismatic, and that was certainly one of the reasons why United hired him, to kind of be the face of the club and handle that responsibility with the articulacy and the nuance that it requires. And okay, sometimes he is very soul-bearing and gives perhaps too much honesty in answers, but as a journalist you always would appreciate that. But even obviously in terms of his own position, he's been been given a lot of candour, hasn't he? But I think that for as much as he is that way in press conferences, he doesn't go beyond his obligations in terms of media engagements. So he doesn't sort of, try and court the press in any kind of way to, get favourable coverage, shall we say. He does what he's required to do. He says as openly as he can do what he wants to say. But then with the players, it's a different sort of story. So it's kind of, that's what I thought was an interesting angle, that he is a strong character. So you're sort of thinking Erik ten Hag was a strong disciplinarian, and he was.
Yeah.
But Ruben Amorim is no less so. And I think that's a kind of interesting sort of strand to extract from this whole past year.
Just on Amorim as well, because me and Jay were chatting about this the other day, and it's almost crazy to me that considering the results that we've had up until the last month or two, it still always felt like, and yes, there's been times where as fans we thought after the Brentford game this might be the beginning of the end. It's like, can he turn it around from here? And you start to question that. But especially in the press, who, I'm not just talking about you, but just the general feeling you get from the people in the room with him week in, week out, people still seem to like him, despite the fact that it was the worst pretty much anyone in that room had ever seen in their lives, let alone in their working lives at Manchester United. There was maybe some questioning of his systems and of his, longevity at United, but when you speak to people, they all seem to go, I want this to work for him. He seems like a good guy. How far does that go, do you think? Not just with the media and people like yourself, but with the players and, just the people around him and the Jason Wilcox and all that. Like, his personality, how much of that has helped him get through what we've seen for 11 of the last 12 months?
I think it is a big aspect, and whilst it isn't necessarily giving results on the pitch just by having a good personality or an interesting personality, it is a relevant part of the job, because not only in terms of communicating with fans, who are the people that pay the wages ultimately, and he is very attuned to that. Not only himself, when you see him outside Old Trafford or Carrington or wherever, he will pose for pictures and kind of give his time graciously. He's pretty engaged with it. He's not sort of just going through the motions with it. And he also laid down a rule that he wanted, his squad, half of his squad to sign autographs before the game, half the squad to sign autographs after, which was outside Old Trafford, which is a kind of, a sign that he values, the people that are paying the money to watch the game and create an atmosphere. And in the end, I think players basically just did it before games, or are doing it before games, because they didn't want to be sort of walking past people asking for autographs and kind of ignoring them. So it sort of created a bit of a moment there anyway for people waiting by the players' entrance at Old Trafford. But yeah, I think also if he's a likeable guy. I totally agree with that. We came out of our sort of interview with him in Chicago on pre-season tour, sort of pretty much unanimously going, he's a compelling person, and you can understand why at Sporting he had such success, bringing people with him and kind of making them believe in what he was saying. And I think that comes from, there's a little bit of for as much as he probably has that. You might look at his stubbornness and say that there's a form of arrogance there in terms of him not changing his his system. There's a humbleness to him as well, when he will say, I was kind of like uncertain going to matches because I didn't know what team I was going to get. And we've asked him about potentially walking away, and he's been very sort of open about that. And I think that is quite an endearing quality to have. And I can only suspect that, he has daily conversation with Jason Wilcox, who will watch training, and then obviously he's in the boardroom as well. So he's got that sort of twin role to his job. But I can only suspect that they're having, pretty good, honest conversations. And that then means that in those hairy moments, like after Brentford, and you're absolutely right, it felt like it was potentially unravelling there with that game sort of collapsing as it did. I think that's what then means that these people want to give him more of a chance and want to see it through. I do also accept that their reputations are now aligned. Or, they were from the get going to Ruben Amorim, because obviously the other options that were available, and Dan Ashworth departing as sporting director. You've got Omar Barada as chief executive, who did very much, I think, lobby for Ruben Amorim, and then went out to Lisbon to do the deal with the president of Sporting. So, and then you've got Sir Jim Ratcliffe at the top of it all. Not to mention the Glazers that are still around and still have a voice at the executive committee meetings, to my understanding. But I think Ratcliffe obviously is the guy that is making all the decisions, and so he seems to like Ruben Amorim as well, for that reason that you said, the kind of honesty that he has, for telling him to fuck off, basically, if he has a conversation with him at Carrington and he oversteps his territory, Ratcliffe. And it seems to me that Ratcliffe quite likes that blunt speaking. Obviously, he has the sort of the words in their Ineos compass that they kind of like, and sort of northernness and kind of sort of, I don't know, kind of plain speaking, I think, are among the kind of the qualities that he likes. So I think Amorim has that. So I do agree with you. I think that kind of does help him in these difficult moments. Ultimately, results will dictate things, though. It can't, you couldn't have, several losses in a row and just keep going off and saying that, well, he's good with the media, so let's keep him in charge. But clearly, it's had an upturn more recently, and I think everybody that's connected to United will hope that continues.
What do you get a sense of what's led to that upturn? Is it just a case of more time on the training ground? You mentioned about, that they have had more time, obviously, because of the fewer midweek games. Is there a people buying in finally thing? Is it just the quality of the players and partnerships starting to kind of link together? The likes of Burmo and Ahmad seem to have a connection where maybe in the first 2 or 3 games of the season they were occupying similar spaces and sort of almost running into each other at times, didn't we? What do you think it is that's led to this? Because I would say personally, I think the performances all season have definitely been a jump better than they were last season. Is it just that, coming out in the wash and the XG and the chances have just meant United have won the last few games? Or do you think something else has happened? Why do you think we've seen this?
I think all the games, there's margins, isn't there, involved in all of them. So against Arsenal, I think they were unlucky to lose, for example. Maybe Fulham, you could say they could have won that one. And so this kind of run could have maybe happened earlier, but equally, they were well beaten, I would say, at Man City, even then they had sort of chances, didn't they? Brentford was the real damaging one. Obviously, the Grimsby match in amidst all this, which I just don't think United players were, maybe even the coaching staff were switched on to, the level that they could get against a League Two opponent. So that was the real damaging one, wasn't it? That kind of made people think, oh wow, okay, what are we experiencing here? I just think that you're getting a better run of things now, so they are taking the chances. Senna Lomon's coming in, since he started, United haven't lost, and I think going more direct is certainly incubated United from conceding the kind of goals that then were seeing them lose matches. And I guess you've got, I think, a base layer of quality in the team that over time should win your matches. And really, you could perhaps look at the Forest and Tottenham games as United leaving points on the table there, given they were leading in both of them, and could have seen the game through on different occasions. But maybe that shows where they're at in their current arc, where they're unable to actually keep chances to a minimum to win these kind of games when it is tight away from home. And I guess that's something that Amorim will be looking to progress in the next few months and year or two, if they can get some more signings in the transfer market. But I don't know if you can kind of point your finger to it. And equally, I do feel like it could also still be a slightly fragile upturn. You could, given the way that Spurs were able to come back against United, the quick goals again, both games, Forest and Spurs, sort of fairly soon after each other. So there's that sort of fragility to United, I think, still. So I'm having some, expressing some caution in my assessment of it, whilst at the same time probably looking at the table going, well, it's such a condensed league and all teams are showing some brittleness that actually United should really seize this moment as an opportunity to even go as far as getting into the Champions League ultimately, with no European competition to distract them this season. But I think it's a combination of things. Certainly Lamans has simplified things, hasn't he, with his long kicks. You've got Mbumo scoring. It feels like players are understanding their roles better, and I agree with you, the Ahmad and Mbumo link up down the right is a real fascinating strand of all this, because it was sort of, I was looking at it thinking, well, Ahmad's being pushed out of his best position. Well, actually, as we're going along, we're seeing that he can still get into those key danger areas. And obviously at Spurs, he was actually as a number 10 who was playing alongside Mbumo. So, but I think the kind of the possibilities of this formation are there to see if you've got players that are highly skilled in the final third and also have got the energy to get up and down. And it seems like Ahmad, in certain matches can certainly do that.
There's a graphic on the article about the expected goals sort of conceded and created per game over the last kind of basically 3 years. And it's obviously, in a dream world, you want the amount of chances you create to have as big a gap between that compared to the amount of chances that you concede, so that each week the odds of you losing a game that you've massively outcreated the opposition are obviously going to be very low. Now, for most of, not just last season, since basically game week 10 of the 23-24 season, so 2 and a bit seasons ago, Manchester United almost every week until this season were out XG'd by their opposition. Basically, I know not everyone likes XG, but if you just use it as a sort of rough barometer of the types and quality of chances that both teams are creating, United have really struggled. And that is something that has flipped. And it flipped toward the end of last season. And then this season, again, the gap isn't massive. You want it to almost be sort of foolproof, where you're creating so many more chances than the opposition that you would need a miracle for them to score all of theirs and you to not score any of yours. But fundamentally, football comes down to sort of maths and numbers, doesn't it? You can't win a game you don't have shots in. And across the season, yes, better players will outperform and score better goals than worse players. But if you get your players really good chances and stop the opposition having good chances, you're going to win more games than not. Has a focus been on conceding fewer chances? Because I know we haven't scored enough, but we're one of the highest conceding teams in the league, even this season. I think in the top 15, we are the highest in terms of goals conceded. Is that something that's maybe the next step, trying to concede fewer goals?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think their XG conceded this season is it 16th in the league or something? So yeah. I think they're third for XG, created, so behind City and Palace, and then they're right down the table on the other side of things. And I suppose that's a preferable way to be from a United point of view. You want entertainment, you want goals. And that was the area that they felt they had to address in the summer. The fact that they'd scored, it's been pretty poor for the last 3 seasons, maybe even 4 seasons since Ole Gunnar Solskjaer left, and then he's in that season that obviously he was dismissed. So really low numbers for scoring. So they had to address that, and obviously that's what they did do with Cunha and Bumo, Premier League proven goal scorers, and we're seeing that certainly within Bumo, and I think we will see it with Cunha as well. And then adding Sesko on top as a kind of a really promising younger player that they felt could develop with the club. But yeah, 3 new attackers, that was the idea that they felt that they needed to improve on. Now, I think you also had some people at the club, possibly even Ruben Amorim himself, that might have gone for a midfielder instead. And certainly there were talks, obviously, to see whether the move for Carlos Baleba could come to fruition. And that's obviously something that United will continue to look at. And maybe that then would help. I know, perhaps you need a defender as well in there, but I think having a midfield that is able to cover ground and snuff out those opportunities for teams before they even get to the box is certainly something that United would like to add to their team. For as much as Casemiro has done well, and even Bruno Fernandes in that deeper role, I think he's had a pretty sort of decent season so far. So that's something that they want to address, and maybe that is where you then see United being able to repel rival attacks a bit better.
I want to talk more about midfielders and how that can change, and maybe some transfers in that position in a minute. But before we move on from the sort of tactical side of things, I want to just read a little excerpt from the piece, just to kind of move us in a different direction about tactics. So it says, still, some players have wondered whether the system suits the team. Jason Wilcox, who rose from technical director to director of football over the past year after Dan Ashworth departed as sporting director, has held discussions with Amorim on the formation. Wilcox is known to like the 4-3-3 that brought Man City dominance. He has a strong relationship with Amorim, and the pair speak daily. Wilcox watches training on the touchlines at Carrington. Amorim has said that his system will evolve over time when he's ready, and he has laid out his team in a 4-3-3 for parts of some sessions, but this is mainly to embed understanding for certain phases of play during matches. In terms of the formation and the system and Amorim's flexibility, how do you see this panning out over the next sort of months and years? Do you see a pressure from the players potentially, or from the likes of Jason Wilcox to change to a 4 at the back system? Is that something Amorim would be open to? Or do you think, as long as they defend in certain shapes and attack certain ways, people don't really mind the formation? Because a lot has been made of the formation, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And certainly I would imagine that Amorim, from speaking to people that had an idea, would think that too much has been made of it, and
Okay.
accepting that obviously you need to shift the squad on, but by the same token, just sort of commitment on the pitch, quality has been the issues that have let the team down so far, rather than a certain player being in a certain position. And I think you can certainly point to games where it felt like it's that system is a reactive one and a deeper lying one that then you can't really take control of games with, and certain personnel within that would then dictate that, I would say. But I can't see him now changing the system. He said not even the Pope could get him to do that, unless he wants to. But I just don't. I think it's become such a it is such a fundamental pillar of his coaching style that he thinks that football should be can be better this way. If you have three centre backs where one of them is your main central defender, and then the two on the either side are actually quite progressive and can get forward. And De Ligt has done this actually this season pretty well. Yoro obviously can carry the ball well. Luke Shaw has been a real benefit, I think, in that left centre back role because he's fundamentally a full back. So if you get those kind of players in that system, then it can actually be a pretty aggressive attacking system. And obviously then the wing backs are really important for getting 6 men in the box. There was a couple of moments, wasn't there, at Spurs for Mbumo's goal, where you had 6 players sort of basically in the box, or at least on the edges, both wing backs, the 3 attackers, and then Bruno as well. And that was when Dorgu was crossing it from the left, and then when Ahmad was crossing it for the right for Mbumo's header. That to me looked like the realisation, of Amorim's vision. And so I think that it's more about the personnel necessarily. Now, you might say United historically has been a club where the success has been built on wingers driving forwards and fast attacks and that kind of thing. I think there's scope for that within this system, certainly. If you have these kind of wing backs that can really motor, and there is opportunities for winning, as we've seen, as they did at Anfield, winning second balls and then having those kind of transition moments, it can still have that fast flowing feel to it. And so I think Bumo's a perfect player for that as well. The runs in behind he makes are very smart, and he's got a speed on him. So I'd be intrigued to see how that can develop. In terms of his relationship with Wilcox, and players maybe feeling that it doesn't suit them. I think that's kind of inevitable when you're shifting the system so much. There was probably those questions about Erik ten Hag, wasn't there, when the midfield was kind of pointed out as being an issue, the gaps in midfield. And so there's probably ways in which you can mitigate those issues, but I think you're always going to get people with different opinions, and obviously Wilcox saw success with Man City's 4-3-3 that was basically instilled by Pep Guardiola and then replicated throughout the academy that Wilcox was in charge of. So you can understand why he would, in discussions maybe with Ruben Amorim, talk about that. But as far as I'm aware, it's not been something that has been suggested to Amorim to change. I think they understand his view on his system, and that they hired him in full knowledge that was going to be the case. I think it would be perhaps a strange departure to then sort of suggest changing it. And he has to have control of that. You can't be, as much as you want people to have good understanding of football in the executive positions that you can have these genuine dialogue with. I think that it has to be a case of letting the head coach, in this case, sort of make the decision on that.
Yep, I completely agree. I hope that they do back him, and that there isn't this sort of background sense of if he changed it, we'd be better, and eventually there's going to be a sort of a swing against Amorim that comes down to differences in the system. Because like you said, they knew what they were hiring, they knew what he played at Sporting. If you didn't want that, why would you hire someone else, basically? Or why would you not hire someone else? Let's move on to this midfield then in particular, and look at sort of some transfers, because your colleague and friend, and obviously he's been on the channel many times before here as well, Andy Mitten, was talking on Talk of the Devils last week, I believe, talking about Elliot Anderson. And obviously the midfield is an area that's been mentioned a lot over the last few months. It seems clearly an area that United are interested in. We've made inquiries around Baleba, so I think we can say with some certainty United want midfielders. I think the quote he used was, I'm going to paraphrase, so but he used the phrase, United are the most well positioned or what was?
I think it was just well positioned, not necessarily most.
So yes. There you go. Well positioned in terms of an approach, or I didn't even understand whether he meant as in he works as the sort of his positioning and his play style would be best suited to United of the players we're linked with.
Yeah.
Whether United as a club are positioned well in terms of a transfer for him, which I think is what everyone wants him to have been saying. But he sort of made a point of phrasing it in that particular way, didn't he? I know you chat to him, obviously, not off the podcast and stuff as well. What do you think he meant, and what's your understanding of United's sort of approach for Elliot Anderson, if there is one?
Yes, I love this Mitten 2.0 version that is now sort of dropping transfer updates. When
hints as well, real sneaky hints.
Little sneaky. Yeah. When he is, he coined the phrase "transfer junkies," so he says anyway, about the kind of need for being fed information on transfers at all times in this social media world. I think obviously, when it kind of comes out, if you don't listen to it, you don't necessarily understand that there's a long pause between him starting it and then finishing it with well positioned. I think he just was trying to choose his words carefully because, as he freely admits, he doesn't usually get involved. He doesn't do the minutiae of transfers. He doesn't really do, the kind of this player's now joining this club exclusive, even though he probably has a lot of information on that kind of stuff. So I think he felt that he needed to be careful with his words because he knows that if he says something, it will, come out. It'll get aggregated, right? And it'll
as it did, of course,
as it did. So I think whereas if he's kind of saying transfer updates all the time, then maybe it doesn't have the same impact, I suppose. But it's like, okay, Andy doesn't usually get that involved in this kind of stuff, so okay, let's pay attention to it. So yeah, obviously I've been teasing him about it away from the podcast. I think he's just sort of saying that he's obviously a player that United like, right? Elliot Anderson. Okay. Now, to what degree are they going to go and pursue it? Let's see. January, to my mind, was always a bit too soon. I have sort of since that point, so it was basically put to me that if United were to do anything, it would probably be loans, in the circumstance that Kobbie Mainoo departs on loan, because you expect that he will make that case again, as he did do in the summer transfer window, because he's still not playing, he's not starting matches, is he? So you can understand him wanting to try and go and get regular minutes, and so that he can potentially force his way into Thomas Tuchel's England squad. But I don't know if United would let Kobbie Mainoo go in January. If they do, they'd have to get a replacement. Are they going to get a replacement of the same quality, of the same understanding of what Amorim wants? It's a tricky one. Now, then, speaking to people sort of more recently, I don't know. I sort of wonder if maybe they do, have a look at and see if something can be done in January. If, say, for example, there's that opportunity for Champions League qualification straight away this season, then do they go again and sort of think, let's try it? They obviously, as you say, speaking about the Belabour conditions, ultimately it was too much money from their perspective. But I suppose that did show, and this was, whilst they were still negotiating the Sesko thing a little bit, but obviously the Sesko was the one they pressed ahead with, but it did sort of show potential scope for doing it. Now, they would have to dip back into the revolving credit facility, no doubt. You've got the PSR and FFP calculations as well that become a factor if you do it before that June 30th deadline. And so, I'm still a little bit sceptical, but I'm kind of not ruling out that United would at least have those kind of conversations to see if something can be done.
I mean, it's very exciting, isn't it? And like we said, it did appear as though if United were willing to potentially do a deal last summer, then in terms of the sort of financial year, January fits in with that, because it goes end of June to end of June, as you sort of mentioned there. Just for the sake of quoting Andy directly, I can't, like you said, I'm not going to put in the pauses and the exact. Go
on, do the pause for like a minute. Just have a minute of silence for Andy's transfer update. So
the quote was, Elliot Anderson is the midfielder who would be well positioned to join Manchester United at the moment, which is, again, I do implore people to listen to the show anyway, to the link of which will be put in the description. But it was, like you said, kind of hearing him say it almost feels less definitive than reading it written down, doesn't it? But it's interesting to know that, there's clearly an interest there, clearly an admiration for the player. We mentioned Belabor. Most of what you hear from him and read about him this season is how bad he's been. He wasn't particularly good against United, I didn't think, for Brighton. And also some of that was made easier to see by he had a couple of sort of long-range shots that were nowhere near, that had some sort of ironic cheers around them as well. What other names are sort of in the frame? We hear Adam Wharton, you hear Belabor, you hear obviously Anderson as well. Who is it that United are interested in? What type of player? Because they're not all exactly the same type of player even, are they?
Yeah, well, I mean, you clearly need a replacement for Casemiro. You know, if he goes, obviously his contract comes up at the end of the season. They've got the +1. There's no way they're going to trigger that +1. I just assumed that he was also just going to leave the club. And that's probably the likeliest outcome. You know, it was the transfer that Sir Jim Ratcliffe highlighted as being, wrong, everything that's wrong about United when he was kind of looking through the accounts and so for then Casemiro to actually stay on under Ratcliffe's tenure would be an amazing career arc. I think he's sounding quite, he would like to stay, Casemiro, but then is that I'd like to stay on my current salary, or is that I'd like to stay whatever the offer might be? But that'll be something that they only have a look at, I think, towards the end of the season. That United would be in no rush to sort of trying to have a look at that. I don't think. But whatever, you'd still need a replacement for him long term, because he's not the long term answer, is he, at all? So
no.
And that role is a sort of more, as you say, it's more holding, isn't it? It's the number 6 role. Is that what Elliot Anderson is? I would say Elliot Anderson's probably more of a combative sort of number 8 almost, which is sort of the role that Bruno Fernandes is doing. Now, Bruno Fernandes spoke to us recently about his future and everything that happened with Saudi Arabia's interest, particularly Al Hilal last summer. He was saying that nothing's been sorted at all. No talks have happened for next summer. But I guess that's still, his future is still a little bit uncertain, depending on what he wants and what United want to do. Amorim, though, I think more recently in a press conference said that Bruno needs to be ready for rotation next season. So maybe he's, whilst that's a good line in itself, it also does sort of say, okay, so you are planning with him next season. So, but yeah, then so Carlos Baleba, I would also say he's a kind of number 8 really. And Wharton gets forward. Wharton creates chances, doesn't he? You'd sort of think he could be a number 6, but I think having somebody that's got that Premier League experience is a big factor for United, just so that they've got that, I guess, assurance that they could have a smoother transition into the team. As we've seen with Cunha and Mbeumo, they've come in and instantly made impact. I know that you can point to the stats around Cunha, but I think generally his quality and his sort of involvement has been certainly telling, and I think it's unquestionable with Mbeumo. So I think that's the kind of strategy that United would like to continue with. I mean, I think it was funny, wasn't it, to see at the weekend. I was just watching the highlights actually of Wharton tackling Belabor in the Palace versus Brighton game, and then setting up a chance for it. Ended up being Sarr, and they kind of messed around with it. But anyway, it was quite interesting that he was pressing high in that instance, Wharton, and Belabor was sort of on the ball. And yeah, it's funny. I mean, the Belabor one, Brighton were basically saying I don't think they ever gave a number to the people that were kind of having those discussions on behalf of United and Brighton and the player, but he clearly wanted to join United. I don't think personal terms would have been a problem at all. I think he might have even agreed them, and so but the whole stance from Brighton was that he's £100 million player plus Moises Caicedo type fee. United kind of entered the sort of talks under the perhaps understanding that João Pedro kind of fee would work, 60 million or so, and there was a sort of argument at one point that I'd heard that made that this might be the best time to sell Belay because he had 2 really good years. Is he guaranteed to have the same level next year? Is he guaranteed that people would that more clubs would be interested in him next summer? And then you get this auction kind of going. And as it's happened so far, at least, I mean, maybe he will absolutely rocket now from now until the end of the season. But it's certainly not been a kind of case of United really missed out by not going for it this summer. So let's see how that one develops. I think there'll be multiple factors that come into who exactly United go for, but certainly from the way the season started, you do think Elliot Anderson is well positioned.
Absolutely. I think with midfielders, the one thing that you can say about most of United's best midfielders, certainly in the deeper positions, is you want consistency. That's what Paul Scholes brought you. That's what Roy Keane brought you. That's what Michael Carrick brought you. Is every single week, it's never going to drop below a 7 out of 10, or maybe a 6.5 on a really bad day. You can't have that kind of sort of a nanny type player there where one day it's 10 and the next day it's 4. You need someone that is going to come in and do the right thing every single time, which I think is one of the criticisms of Bruno. He's a risk taker, which is why you don't usually play risk takers that deep on the pitch. He's perfect as a number 10, but maybe a bit further back he's not. And Elliot Anderson and Wharton, for me, in particular, are consistent, just absolute consistency monsters. Like Anderson, I think, has had the most touches and passes of anyone in the league this season, which is amazing for a player playing for the team in 18th. He's certainly near the top of those metrics. He's someone that you think you could trust him any minute of the game to do the right thing on the ball, and I think that's what United really need. But obviously, we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully, they've got the benefit of waiting a little bit to see who they want to go for. The one thing finally before you go would be the World Cup, because a good World Cup, even though everyone knows you shouldn't buy someone based on a World Cup, let's imagine United were already looking at someone, then they have a good World Cup, it can still add 10 million quid on, even if you can't use a World Cup to buy someone. I mean, I think Enzo Fernandez at Chelsea, certainly his fee wasn't damaged by being the young player of the tournament. How keen do you think United will be to try and get something done before everyone goes off and plays in that World Cup?
Yeah, I think that's a key point, because you just don't know, do you? It adds a variable into the situation that you'd like to avoid. I mean, they even had that this season, though, didn't they, with Cunha and Liam Delap, where 2 players with release clauses. They wanted to get them done quickly. Obviously, Delap went to Chelsea, but still early in the window. They signed Cunha basically as soon as the transfer window opened. So, yeah, I think that's an approach they would like, regardless of the World Cup. But clearly, the World Cup adds a certain acceleration to the process, because you just don't know. Although you say that, and imagine if you sign somebody, they go to the World Cup and pick up an injury, and then you're sort of thinking
that's a good point. Yeah,
we should waited, but yeah, I think the ideal thing is to get them in earlier than later.
Get them done early. Right. Laurie, thank you very much. Speaking of getting people in,
cheers, Joe.
We'll hopefully have you back in the studio very, very soon.
Yes, for sure.
But thank you, as always, for coming on. Thank you at home as well for joining us as well. This has been Inside United with Laurie Whitwell from The Athletic. I'll put the link down to Laurie's socials and, of course, Talk of the Devils podcast in the description, so go and check him out. We'll see you in a bit.